I am now pleased to introduce to you our special guest today, our keynote speaker, young Mr. Anirudh Kanisetti, who perfectly embodies the theme of this convention. He has, in fact, chosen a befitting topic for his speech titled Millennial History Telling India's Past for the Next Generation. Anirudh Kanisetti has certainly not let his age restrict his many achievements. He is the author of Lords of the Deccan, Southern India, from the Chalukyas to the Cholas, a new history of medieval South India. He is a critically acclaimed public historian and writes the Thinking Medieval column for the print and the History Southside column for the Hindustan Times. He has received grants from the Princeton Center for Digital Humanities and the India Foundation for the Arts, and his writings and work have been featured in The Hindu, The New Indian Express, Live Mint, and Scroll.in, among others. He hosts two critically acclaimed podcasts, Echoes of India and Yudh. Looking forward to hearing his views, I now invite Anirudh Kanisetti to deliver the keynote address.
Good afternoon to all of you. My regards to the Honorable Dr. Karan Singh, the Honorable Dr. Rajkumar Ranjan Singh, Major General L.K. Gupta, Chairman INTAC, Dr. C.T. Mishra, Member Secretary INTAC, and Dr. Sari Doshi, Vice Chairman INTAC. I'd like to say at the outset what an honor it is to be giving the keynote address here. I was not even born when INTAC was founded, and many of you in the audience have been working in the heritage and conservation space for decades and have skills and legacies of which I can only dream. I hope that my perspectives will add something fresh to your work, however small, and that together we can try to do justice to our country's incredibly vast, exciting, and forgotten past. I'm sure many of you may be wondering who I am and why I'm here today. I'd like to thank Ms. Modwell for her incredibly kind introduction of my work. And in case any of you are wondering why precisely I do so much, the answer is simple. I believe that all of us are standing at a very unique time and place, not just in the history of our country, but also in the grand history of humanity at large. India is still a very young nation state, at least going by the European concept of a nation. 75 years ago, this great landmass, stretching across dozens of unique ecologies and linguistic groups, riven by issues of caste, gender discrimination, inequality, and with a predominantly rural population, emerged as a single democratic nation state. We've had our achievements and our tragedies in the decades since, as any country does, but the fact that I am here today, addressing people from across the subcontinent, of many religions, of many mother tongues, of many ages and genders, is extraordinary. Only 7 or 8 generations ago, what I'm doing here would have been pretty much unthinkable. We also live in a time of unprecedented connectivity. It's a time when unprecedented numbers of our fellow citizens are connected to global networks of knowledge. History is playing an extremely important role in our politics. Across the country, young people are turning to history to try and understand questions of who we are and where we come from. And very often, the answers they find make them sad, angry, fearful, and resentful. Our land is and has been home to 1/6 of all of humanity. In the 21st century, what we choose to think about our past will be crucial not only to understanding what it means to be Indian, but really what it means to be human. It's in this context that I want to tell you a story that made me, as a historian, very jealous. It might seem like a tangent, but please bear with me. 2 weeks ago, I was invited to Azim Premji University to address their Department of History, and I went out for dinner with a couple of professors afterwards. As we tucked into plates of hot parotas and biryani, one of the professors told me about a podcast that he had been listening to about the Crusades. And I'm sure you know what the Crusades are. They were a series of conflicts between European and Asian powers in the 12th century. Now, the 12th century was 900 years ago. And in India, as all of you know, there isn't a lot of information surviving from 900 years ago. What we have is mostly just scattered land grants to temples, allowing us only the broad outlines of what happened, maybe a glimpse of something every decade or so. I've tried very hard to write podcasts and books about the period, but there's only so much I can do without sources. If I really push myself, maybe I could make a dozen podcast episodes. I want you to guess how many podcast episodes this professor had heard about the Crusades. Hundreds. Hundreds. For every year of the 12th century, Europeans have information about personalities from peasants to monks to knights to kings. They can reconstruct their motivations, their clothing, their beliefs, their loves, their rivalries. Their universities have been able to churn out vast quantities of materials on all of these details, which are picked up by publishers and then by a flourishing public history industry that produces documentaries, films, and TV shows. People make TikToks, Reels, and YouTube shorts. Others write historical fiction. Now, imagine this as a cycle with four stages. Stage one, the existence of hard historical evidence, leads to stage two, which is critical research in universities, which leads to stage three, accessible writing by history communicators like myself, and finally to stage four, entertaining content by media industries and content creators. This in turn creates a feedback loop. As people see entertaining content in stage 4, they get curious about reading books, which is stage 3, and that generates more interest in stage 2, which is academic research, and so on and so on. Now, let me give you an example. I'm sure that even if many of us have not watched it, we've heard of Game of Thrones. It's a multi million dollar blockbuster TV show about aristocratic families set in a Western fantasy world. Now, if you were to Google the real history behind Game of Thrones, now it was based on this British Civil War, a conflict known as the War of the Roses, you'll see hundreds, if not thousands, of blogs, web pages, videos about the actual historical events behind the series. Now, if you were to Google the real history behind any Indian TV show, I'm pretty sure it'd be very hard pressed to find even a single article explaining what the actual history behind those events was. You'll also see, if you were to check on Google Trends, that there's a massive spike in the number of searches and the curiosity for War of the Roses in 2012, which is when the second season of Game of Thrones came out. And I'm willing to bet that all of this had a significant effect not only on book sales, but also on academic research soon after. Now, as a historian of medieval South India, I can't help but imagine what if we had detailed historical records about, let's say, the Chola Chalukya Wars in the 11th century? Imagine if we knew in detail the military innovations and tactics, the lives and politics of various commanders, marriage alliances, betrayals, and how all of these generated violent conflict between these two great empires. Imagine if that could be channeled into inspiration for an Indian fantasy show. Imagine if that took the world by storm and inspired more and more content and interest in Indian history. This seems like a very rosy picture. We are very far from it in 2022, unfortunately. And to bring it back to the story I told you a little while ago, that's why I felt jealous when the professor told me about listening to hundreds of episodes about the Crusades. We just don't have that level of primary material about medieval India. And there are various limitations in what our scholars and our content creators are able to say. And so, compared to the West, we have a long way to go in terms of getting young people to engage with history. But that doesn't mean that nothing can be done. I think there are some aspects that India is already doing better than the West is. Firstly, at the beginning of the loop in stage one, hard historical evidence. Our institutions have done a magnificent job of compiling the most important primary sources and making digital copies of them available on archive.org. I could never have written my book or my podcasts if not epigraphical material and important histories from our public libraries had not already been digitized and made available online. And also, India has a tremendously creative and energetic young population who are looking out for new histories and new ways to engage with it. I've made serious works of research as well as more informal, entertaining content such as memes and short videos, and all of them have performed extremely well. I was absolutely overjoyed when I found out that one page on Instagram was actually making memes or jokes about my book, because that shows you that is really getting out there. People are really engaging with my work. I still smile to think of collaborations I've done with children's illustrators and writers, with young graphic designers, with history walk enthusiasts, with filmmakers and teachers, some of whom have over the years become some of my dearest friends. I've even had the joy of working with Intact Bengaluru, making art and writing about thousands of years of the region's history. Doing all this work and meeting all these incredible people has been one of the great thrills and honors of my life. and has given me great confidence for what's to come. To add to what Dr. Mishra has said, it is not just the future but also history that belongs to young people. With all this said and done, we have a long way to go if we want to really engage and bring young people on board with the project of understanding our past. While I've had some delightful experiences and creative collaborations online, I also want to tell you about one that was less pleasant but still quite amusing. I had made a meme about the Chola Empire and its construction of temples and an endowment of Brahmin agraharams, and a young Tamil boy who couldn't have been more than 14 or 15 years old put in a very grumpy comment saying that the caste system didn't exist in Tamil Nadu and it was only introduced by the Vijayanagara Nayakas many centuries later. He then said, with truly awe inspiring confidence that I wish to emulate in my life going forward, "Read history before making fun, you Telugu idiot." That's an amusing example, of course. But I've had much more unpleasant run ins with trolls who have threatened me with all sorts of abuse. I've had friends whose families were attacked, whose business were attacked. And I don't want to brush under the carpet what a challenge this is for telling histories in India. Even if we were to dismiss these as the activities of radicalized teenagers, there's also institutional backing in some cases. We've all seen the controversy about Padmavat and the enormous protests even before the film came out. Even the renowned director Mani Ratnam has had a case filed against him for relatively minor issues in how he has depicted the Cholas in his upcoming film Ponniyin Selvan. On the one hand, rigorous critiques of historical entertainment is important because it helps bring out nuance that would otherwise be lost. But when there's violence and cases filed, it puts a chilling effect on investors and creatives. Success in creating entertainment content revitalizes every stage of the public history cycle. Similarly, attacks and over politicization also discourage writers, historians, and reduces fundings that would otherwise go into archaeological research and finding new primary sources. Now, from some perspectives, this might appear to be a good thing because it makes it easier to rewrite history into a single narrative. But that's not an approach that I personally agree with, because how can there be a single narrative of the past when we can't agree on a single narrative for the present? If only one kind of historical narrative is made, it beggars us all. It prevents us from seeing the wonders and creativity of what our past was truly like. Surely it can't be the case that all of history, all those thousands of years, all those millions of people happened and lived only to confirm the political decisions and biases of the last 10 years. So, how do we tell histories that appeal, that excite, that inspire younger people? I think that trying to make history a moralistic or preachy tale about how great kings and queens were is somewhat reductive. At the same time, I'm not the biggest fan of Game of Thrones because it makes history out to be mostly about blood and nudity, and I know that more things were going on historically. These sell well, but they're very modern ideas of what glamour is. History doesn't need to be glamorous. History doesn't need to preach or sell to be important. History needs to resonate. I'm sure that all of us would agree that we aren't happy with the world we live in. Why then should the past be a place that we completely agree with? Surely our ancestors lived in a world that they didn't completely love, and to do justice to them, we must also write histories that challenge. That's why I think the simplest and most straightforward way, and what has worked well for me, is to talk about history as something that happened to real people, people just like all of us. My mother did a Ganesha puja last Wednesday and sprinkled my head with turmeric rice. How many generations before me felt similar grains of rice in their hair after a puja? Even if their lives were completely different from mine, even if they faced much greater discomforts in life, I know that we had this intimate human sensation in common. Similarly, I like to tell stories of our ancestors, feeling wonder, feeling humility, feeling amusement, feeling joy, loss, greed, hate, and all of these are parts of the human experience. And to me, they are the basis of telling a story that is believable and interesting to young people. Another example. By the sheerest coincidence, I stumbled across a Sanskrit drama called The Padataditaka of Shyamilaka. Now, like many of us, I have read my fair share of Kalidasa, which, while splendid and evocative and all the great adjectives, is very much about the epic exploits of gods and kings rather than ordinary people doing ordinary things. But the Padataditaka is exactly the latter. It's about socialites in the courtesan's district of 5th century Ujjain talking about a minor scandal that erupted because a courtesan kicked a rich young client of hers in the head. Immediately, I made a voice acted podcast about it, and it's still by far one of my most listened to episodes. History doesn't need to preach or be serious. It doesn't need to provide some grand lesson all the time. And younger people, especially, get fed up with that very quickly, as I'm sure all of you would know from your children. Instead, we can tell histories with irreverence, empathy, and warm, good humor, and people will respond to it naturally. I'm often told that I've made history cool, but I don't really see it that way. I think there's something inherently engaging about someone who is passionate about the work they do, and that inspires and encourages people to do similar work. I've been lucky to have the opportunity to nurture my passion up to this point, especially lucky considering that, like most middle class South Indians, I actually studied engineering. I want to make sure that more young people get the opportunities that I have had, and that they will in turn help change things for others like them. I want to make sure that young people from the Northeast, from the East and West Coasts, from the Himalayas, get to tell their histories before a national audience, just as I am. Now, this is all from the perspective of individuals. I think there's also some institutional changes that we need to make that could have tremendous impact within a generation. One idea that was floated in the draft Science, Technology, and Innovation Policy 2020 was One Nation, One Subscription, wherein the central government proposed that it would negotiate with academic publishers to provide access to scientific journals for all citizens. I think the basic idea is sound and that it should be expanded and encouraged. Indian citizens, especially younger citizens like me, need access to quality research in the historical and humanities space. I have been lucky to work with organizations that allowed me to download cutting edge research from the best universities in India and abroad, but that is not the same for most young Indians. We need to allow more young people with more diverse views to explore and tell their histories as easily as possible. And this is just the beginning. I think that we need massive efforts in expanding public libraries, and much more needs to be done with digitizing and uploading manuscripts. It's tremendously exciting to see the government of Telangana announcing that it will repair and digitize over 43 million manuscripts in its state archives in collaboration with the Noor International Microfilm Center. This will allow us to study the cosmopolitan sultanates of the Deccan in unprecedented detail. We can only hope that this move will encourage more state governments to follow suit and that these digitized texts will be translated and made available to the public. One of the projects that I have worked on at the Museum of Art and Photography, where I'm an editor on the Encyclopedia of Indian Art, is called Interwoven. It's an artificial intelligence driven tool that allows you to explore related objects from various museum collections. Now, while we were able to set up collaborations with nearly a dozen Western museums who have digitized their holdings, we found that many museums and private collections in India lack the resources to do the same. In some cases, even when an Indian collection is digitized, its owners are reluctant to make them accessible due to concerns such as copyright. Now, some of these issues can be addressed with legislation, others will require financial investment. We found that a single museum in the US, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, has a budget of nearly $395 million. That is more than most of our union and state level institutions combined. Imagine if any one of you conveners had those kinds of resources and what you could do in your districts with that kind of money. Now, certainly, as a nation, we have considerable financial constraints and responsibilities, but there's still an urgent need to upgrade our heritage resources and infrastructure. And these would have tremendous benefits and downstream effects, like the public history cycle I outlined earlier. For example, if grants could be given to private Indian collectors to digitize their holdings for the public, we could easily create a repository that future generations could make into some of the world's best historical studies, writings, and media. These are not pointless or frivolous expenditures, but investments that are well worth making today. Finally, I'd also like to note that our fellow Indians already do excellent work, photographing well known heritage sites and uploading images onto Wikipedia. Now, imagine if there were more awards and grants for going to out of the way temples and places and documenting them. Or even if this was taught in universities and schools and if students got academic credits for it. The knowledge and materials and talent are out there. I'm just suggesting that they be assembled and made easier for more people to access. And this can be achieved with some institutional changes and incentives. Younger people want to take the lead when it comes to history, but we need to be convinced that we can really make careers in this space. I am sure I'm running late on time, so let me bring this speech to a close. I'm often asked, should we not feel pride when we think about our past? Should we not hesitate to point out the darknesses and injustices that may have happened? Because that would be denigrating our ancestors. To this, I will say, certainly I feel pride when I think of everything that has been achieved in our land by people like us, innumerable, diverse, from the icy peaks of the Himalayas to the balmy shores of Kerala. But more than pride, I feel humility. To think of thousands, millions of people who felt the same emotions: despair, wonder, inspiration, terror, greed, anger, and most importantly, love and hope. To think of myself as inheriting their glories and tragedies, the glories and tragedies of 1/6 of humanity, gives me a responsibility. I have a responsibility to be honest about what they went through without trying to impose my own limited views on it. I owe this not only to our nation, but to the grandeur that is the history of our species itself. I realize that all I can do is present our ancestors' history as it was, in all of its moral complexity, whether I agree with it or not. And all I can do is hope that other people like us, people like them, our forefathers and our foremothers, will continue this journey to uncover who we are and where we come from, without presuming to impose our ideas and our politics onto something far older and grander. Let history be free. Let history be about people, about stories, rather than politics. History is never over, and there will always be those who try to do great things in a flow of endless generations of which we are only a small and ephemeral part. History is never over, but my keynote address certainly is. A special thank you to Dr. Meera Iyer of Intact Bengaluru and to Manisha Singh, Director of Intact's Cultural Affairs Division, for bringing me here today. Welcome to the Intact National Convention. My deepest gratitude to you all for listening and my best wishes.
Thank you, Mr. Kanisetti. That was very interesting and indeed brings a fresh perspective to this discourse. Your ideas about engaging the next generation with our historical past are a new look at an old problem. I do agree about the need for history to resonate and to challenge, uh, to be conveyed in a perfect balance between the moralistic and the overly dramatized and glamorized, to be, in fact, humanized. And yes, on a practical note, the material is there, but I agree that perhaps the access to material continues to be a big challenge, something that we also constantly face in our line of work. So we do need to think about solutions for that. So you've raised very many points, and thank you. That was very interesting.